Hello, my name is Tom Brassington. I'm a PhD student at Lancaster University based in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing. My PhD focuses on gender and how it's performed within a branch of literature and culture known as the Gothic. I've been asked by your school to create some resources designed to support your current learning in English classes, to encourage your critical thinking abilities in new and accessible ways, and to give you a flavour of what studying English literature at university can look like. The following explores the musical Blood Brothers, focusing on clothing and costume and how it is used to make characters immediately readable to an audience. Let's start with some quick definitions so we're all roughly on the same page. In this talk, visual communication means how things we see convey information to us in a given cultural context. A simple example of this in the UK is traffic signs, which have a specific visual language used to quickly provide drivers with information, speaking to them without requiring us to read words which take longer to understand. Costume in this talk refers to clothing and accessories typically used for performances, such as musicals. This includes theatrical performances, but can be extended to talk about religious garments, uniforms, and clothing sets that have specific purposes. As an example, there are these two pictures on the bottom, one of a vicar and the dog's collar communicates that to us visually, and that is a mounted guard, and his uniform says military to us because of things like his badges and stuff. So in this talk, I'm going to be analysing costumes and demonstrating how they are used to visually communicate information about characters to audiences before they've even spoken. Now, in fictional contexts, especially visual media like musicals, plays, or films, costumes often have more specific meanings than they do in everyday life. Theatrical productions come with show notes for directors and production teams to create the set design, costume stuff. There are sometimes costume designers on the team who are trained to create outfits which communicate information much more specifically to the audience than someone who is wearing everyday clothes might be trying to communicate something. Even if a character is wearing something that you've seen worn by someone in everyday life, the visual communication of that character will be very different to what that person is visually communicating. It's a very different practice to try and read everyday clothing in a day-to-day context than it is in a performance-based context. Items that visually communicate also have very slippery meanings, since they are largely implicit and rely on the knowledge that you gather by living in a certain cultural and historical moment. Clothing is especially slippery in its meaning-making and communication, since trends change rapidly. High-end designers release new lines in two major installments, spring-summer and autumn-winter, with smaller installments throughout the year, such as resort, which is kind of like holiday wear. Likewise, high street trends change all the time. Even the highway code, the system which determines the meanings of traffic signs, changes with time. So all these meanings that you could determine from clothing is very much bound to the time period that that clothing exists in. And you have to know bits about that time period to properly understand how those clothes are communicating things visually. With that said, let's briefly look at the costumes of Mrs. Johnstone and Mrs. Leon in the musical and the context surrounding them. The musical is one about Britain's social class. Mickey and Edward's lives differ sharply because they are raised in a working class and middle class household, respectively, with Edward benefiting from the social and financial privileges afforded to the British middle classes. Mickey's working class life is one that is not filled with such opportunities. However, before we see Mickey and Edward's lives unfold in wildly different directions, we see Mrs. Johnstone and Mrs. Leon, and how they are costumed works to immediately tell the audience these women's backgrounds. Before they've even spoken, we are being given a set of assumptions about these characters through what they're wearing. Throughout the musical, Mrs. Johnstone wears a range of pinafores and housecoats, while Mrs. Leon wears fitted blouses and blazers. Mrs. Leon also has access to jewellery, hats and gloves. She has much more accessories than Mrs. Johnstone, and her hair is consistently more styled than Mrs. Johnstone's is. So there's some very key differences in how these women are presented, which sets up assumptions for us as the audience to read about to understand their character through. So one example of Mrs. Johnstone's clothes and how it communicates class is her housecoats. Housecoats are used in this musical to communicate to us that she's a working class woman. Alongside pinafores, these clothes functioned as cheap overalls for women so that the better clothes they wore underneath them would not be damaged when doing work. As Blood Brothers is set between the 1960s and 1980s, the work women did largely constituted domestic labour such as cleaning, Mrs. Johnstone is Mrs. Leon's housekeeper, and working in factories. Such work could ruin clothes through the various fluids a housekeeper may use and factory worker may encounter, so having a designated item of clothing which covers other clothes becomes a necessity of this work, and therefore kind of becomes this uniform of working class womanhood. To get an idea of the context in which Mrs. Johnstone is costumed, we're going to cast a net slightly broader and look at some of British television at a similar time period to when Blood Brothers is set. Looking at the British soap character Hilda Ogden reveals how these costume decisions are used to reflect working class British women. Of her Coronation Street character, actress Jean Alexander, here on the left, has commented that, quote, "Like Hilda, my roots were in Liverpool, and that's where I first noticed the curlers and headscarf look. The curlers were put under the headscarf by the factory girls. They had their hair tied up in scarves like that to stop their fashionable long hair getting caught up in the machinery at work. They had curlers in place in case they got asked out on a date, so they'd be ready for a night out after a shift," end quote. In a similar vein, Les Dawson and Roy Barraclough created Cissie and Ada, a series of sketches centered on two gossipy northern housewives. Comedy sketches have to make fun out of something, so that these images of women are readily available for comic use also demonstrates how these costumes are representative of working class womanhood. And as we can see in these pictures, Hilda on the left has this like pinafore which covers her clothes, and she has her hair in curlers like those factory girls that were sort of having to be ready at a moment's notice to go out afterwards. Cissie and Ada are wearing these enormous housecoats to cover their fancier clothes which they wear to go about town or whatever. There's something about these costumes which are there to make you look good at a moment's notice rather than give you time to prepare, because working class women's lives are much more hectic. Going back to Blood Brothers, from her first appearance on stage in the Marilyn Monroe number, we see that Mrs. Johnstone fits into this same dynamic. She regularly goes out dancing after her work, so she needs to be ready to go from work to social event at a moment's notice. This requires her to then have covering clothes to protect the fashionable clothes she wears underneath, her working class life having little time in it for her to go home and get ready for that social occasion or date. The world of the working class British woman in the mid to late 20th century, when Blood Brothers is set, is one of hectic moves between work, home, and social and romantic settings, requiring clothes that suit that rapid pace. Housecoats, with their loose fits and ability to cover most of the body, enable this. More fashionable clothes can be easily covered and will not be compressed by the coat in ways that may produce creases. Their light and breathable fabric won't overheat the wearer due to the multiple layers, so they won't sweat out their makeup or get particularly unpleasant before their dates or social events. And finally, the floral prints that these coats often sport can hide stains well, meaning that it is suitable for multiple wears before washing is required. Such practicality is often the hallmark of working class wear, as well as their affordability and durability. By contrast, Mrs. Leon outright displays her nice clothes. As a middle-class housewife, she has no need for the practicalities offered by clothing like housecoats and pinafores. Her clothes will not get dirty as quickly, and when they do, she can get someone else to wash them. She can also afford to regularly run a washing machine. Middle class wealth allows a person to not think about the economic costs of daily life, or an extra load of laundry may make the electricity bill unaffordable, which seems to be the sort of case of Mrs. Johnston's character. She's constantly worried about bills and things. Additionally, comparing hers and Mrs. Johnston's clothes reveals that Mrs. Leon's clothes fit her better. They're much more sort of tight and slim. She can afford to have her clothes tailored, which again is another demonstration of her own wealth and her position in society on comparison to Mrs. Leon's. Mrs. Leon's clothing presents a perfect example of Thorstein Veblen's sociological theory of conspicuous consumption, published in the Theory of the Leisure Class 1899. Here, Veblen writes that our apparel is always in evidence and affords an indication of our pecuniary standing to all observers at the first glance. End quote. Put more simply, conspicuous consumption is a practice within consumer cultures like our own, where purchasing and displaying certain goods is used to indicate a person's wealth and status, clothing being one of the best modes for conspicuous consumption. We're used to seeing clothes in everyday life, so it's something that we are familiar with reading, and estimating the cost of expensive clothes worn by others is a subtle way of displaying wealth. Mrs. Leon's fitted outfits demonstrate to audiences that this woman has the financial ability to spend money on clothes that fit well, either through tailoring and adjusting them to her size, an additional cost to just buying them in the shop, or through access to more expensive clothing stores. Some stores like M&S or like, I guess, River Island today would be a good example of that. Or even, she might even have access to a made-to-order clothes maker. She has no need for practical clothing like Mrs. Johnstone does either, because the life of a middle-class woman and housewife is not one that is hectic or particularly messy, so Mrs. Leon doesn't need a specific item of clothing to cover her other clothes, because she's just not doing those activities, and her life goes at a much slower pace with big gaps between events. If she's going out for the night, Mrs. Leon has hours to prepare. She can do her hair, she can do her makeup, put on her nice clothes, whilst her cleaner, Mrs. Johnstone, does that messy work. Now, how these costumes communicate visually is something that you probably knew was happening intuitively. You probably had a sense, or just knew, that Mrs. Johnstone is working class because the image in front of you, how she's dressed, matches the image in your head of a working class woman. You see it all the time in media, in popular culture, on TV, in films. You might even know people who dress like that, and they sort of form this vision of working class womanhood. Likewise, we automatically know Mrs. Leon is middle class because how she is presented on stage matches that same image of middle class womanhood that we have, again, as it is informed by media, popular culture, TV and film, and just seeing people in everyday life who are like that. Despite the obviousness of this point, little attention is paid to clothing and costume as they appear in texts. And this is interesting because before Mrs. Johnstone even opens her mouth, how she's dressed tells us a lot about her character. In Britain, we associate housecoats with working class femininity, and Mrs. Johnstone's costume communicates that to us. This is then confirmed when we get to know her as a character through her dialogue and songs and like attitudes with other characters. Likewise, Mrs. Leon's clothes communicate a lot of her characterization before we really know the character. And this is why visual communication is important, because it creates a series of expectations and assumptions for the audience, for you and me watching this musical. It can lead us into siding with one character or another. It can make us scoff when they do something incredibly cliche later on because the clothes set up the expectation in us that this character would act in this way. Likewise, we could be set up with this expectation only to have it dashed later on when they do something out of character, and that creates this moment of like surprise and or like how it's been done. So this is why like reading clothes is quite important, especially in visual media like musicals. So I have a couple of exercises to close out this talk, and I'll outline them now. Please take as much time as you want in completing them. You can pause the video if you choose at this point just to read the questions and take your own time, but I'll read it all out to you anyway. And 2 slides after these slides there was an example of the exercises as well, so you could skip ahead to that to get an idea of how to respond to these questions if you want to. So now that you've hopefully got an idea of how costumes communicate to audiences through my examples of Mrs. Johnston's coat and Mrs. Leon's fitted outfits, respond to the following questions in relation to the costume and character of another character of your choosing from Blood Brothers. So the first question I'd like you to respond to is, what does this outfit tell me about the character when I first see it? Second is, what expectations do I have upon seeing how this character is costumed? 3 is, how do these expectations impact my relationship to the character? 4 is, how does this costume convey these expectations? And the last one is, why have these expectations been set up for me? What is happening in the text which requires these expectations to be made? So now that you've thought about another character in Blood Brothers and how they're costumed and how that is supposed to make you think as an audience member and how that communication is meant to affect you, let's try and expand this and do the same exercise with another character. So think of another character you like and their appearance from any text that you like, any film, anything. Using these same questions as in exercise 1, use them as a scaffolding to help you write about what that character's costume communicates, how that communication is achieved, and why the text wants those expectations to be made. So if it's about if there's a particular superhero you like, what does the costume tell you about that character when you first see it? What expectations are you being set up for? How are you being told to read this character in any particular way? If it's a sort of character from a TV show, think about their clothes and what that's meant to communicate to you and how it tells you about this character. I hope this talk has helped develop your knowledge of Blood Brothers and how visual communication can be a way into reading musicals. Like, in English classes, we're often sort of taught to engage with texts in terms of the written word, and that's good for a starting point for plays and theatrical productions, but it's a visual media and you're an audience member, and that changes the way that we sort of engage with those texts. So it's good to have an idea of how to read aspects of a text, such as a play or a musical, that are presented purely visually, such as through costume. So thank you for listening to this. This talk is partly informed by my own research and from conversations with staff and students in Lancaster's Department of English and Creative Writing. Whilst I cannot take questions on studying English in this talk, please feel free to send any inquiries you might have about studying English to this email address or visit our department's website. Thank you.